define gender, we can launch into how gender is socialized and how our gender identity develops. And when we talk about gender socialization, it's important to understand the difference between gender differences and gender stereotypes. In the last section on this unit, I employed a lot of gender stereotypes. The idea that some women cook more than men, or that some men use tools more than women, and I wasn't using empirical data to back that up. I was using stereotypes. And what are stereotypes? Well, stereotypes are the belief in a difference, but sometimes stereotypes are true and sometimes stereotypes are false. And it doesn't matter if they're true or false, but we believe them. And it's something that hangs in our culture and we tend to agree with and endorse. This is different than a difference. A difference is when we actually do a psychological study and we find that the averages in the gender groups are different. That girls tend to do something more often than boys on average, and a statistically significant difference. That's a difference. Now, the stereotypes that are true would be in this little overlap where the two circles overlap. Stereotypes that are true that represent two true differences would be in that overlap. As we know, there's many more stereotypes than true differences, and we tend to believe in all these little differences in boys and girls or women and men that are not actually backed up by science. Or if they're backed up, it's such a tiny little difference, the effect size would not be significant. In addition, there's also some gender differences that are not supported by stereotypes. There may be gender differences we don't even recognize and don't become stereotypes. And so it's important to understand that these are two different things we're talking about. Now, when we talk about gender socialization, for most of the part, our family, our friends, our teachers, the people around us, they are not aware of these differences that are not stereotypes. All they're aware of is the stereotypes. And so gender socialization tends to be, we socialize each other based on the stereotypes. And that starts playing a role as early as infancy. For instance, we know that babies that are assigned male at birth and babies that are assigned female at birth don't look strikingly different from each other. In fact, if you were to take a baby and wrap it in a yellow, gender-neutral, androgynous blanket and hand it to someone, they would not be able to really guess the gender or the sex of that baby beyond chance. And so we've done this in studies. We've taken babies wrapped in yellow blankets, and if they are female assigned at birth babies, we tell 50% of the recipients that they're girls and 50% they're boys. If they're male assigned at birth babies, we tell 50% of the participants they're boys and 50% they're girls. And what we find is it doesn't actually matter what the baby's sex assigned at birth was, is what we tell the participants, they'll believe it. And when they are under camera and they don't know they're being watched, they will actually treat these babies very different. For instance, if they're told a baby is a boy, whether it's a boy or not, they'll say, "Oh, he's so tough. Look at that guy. He's so strong. What a good little boy." And they'll use a bit of a deeper voice. Versus if we tell them that it's a girl, whether it is or not, they will say, "Oh, she's so precious. What a delicate little darling," with the higher pitched voice. We can see there's differences not just in the tone of my voice, but in the adjective use. And we also find that when people believe they're holding a girl baby, they will talk to that girl baby more often and use more eye contact as compared to when they talk to the boys. Now we know that there's actually a gender difference there. We find that boys tend to make eye contact more than girls, but we just expect them to. And so that might be something we socialize in them right from birth. We expect girls to look at us more than we expect boys to look at us. Right away from infancy, we find that we coat their whole environment in color-coded, gender-specific toys and activities from the get-go. And so the activities we engage in, the types of behaviors we surround the infant with, really starts to socialize them and treat them and train them about some of their gender roles. Of course, a lot of this is come through the family. Regardless of what type of family structure you have, regardless if you have parents that follow stereotypical gender roles or don't, you learn a lot about gender from your parents. And that is, let's say you have parents that do follow stereotypes. Let's say you have a mom who cleans, cooks, and knits, and a dad who does the lawn mowing, who does the car tuning up, and uses a lot of hand tools. That's going to tell you right away, these are things girls do, these are things boys do. If you have the inverse, let's say you have a dad that cooks and a mom that works with tools, you're actually going to learn that. You're going to say boys are better at cooking and girls are good at tools. And that's going to train you. So based on your family's division of labor, you're going to learn what girls can do and what boys can do and what's expected for you to do. If you're in a family with multiple kids or you have brothers and sisters, the way your parents treat the boys versus the girls in your family will also teach you a lot about gender. Is the boy expected to take out the trash, but the girl's expected to do the dishes? Is the boy allowed to have a car and stay out late, but the girl's expected to come home at an earlier hour? How are genders treated differently? and how does that impact how you perceive gender? We know that most parents try to parent in a way that is not super gendered, but some do. And compared to the average mom, the average dad treats their kids in a more gendered way. And so what we mean by this is the average dad will try and protect his daughters and really encourage independence in his sons. Now, moms can still do this, but as compared to dads, moms tend to parent less about gender and more about the kid's personality, strengths, and interests. And so they're more likely to respond to the child for who they are uniquely and not just their gender role. But definitely family is a major socializing agent. And we see this start to play out in infancy. We know that when infants are about 12 months of age, so they've reached the perceptual narrowing for a lot of language skills, they will still look at both feminine stereotyped and masculine stereotyped toys equally as long. If they see a commercial for a princess in a castle or a robot universe, they'll look at them the same. But by 18 months of age, they'll actually pay more attention to things that match their gender role. So they'll start to pay attention to the robots more if they're boys, or pay attention to the princesses more and look longer if they're girls. And then it flips for some interesting reason. By the time they're 2, another 6 months later, it flips and does the opposite. And that's because by the time they're 2, they've really understood who they are in terms of their gender, and they really get that I'm a boy, I like robots. So when they see princesses, they say, oh, that's unusual. And they'll look at that a little bit longer. Or if they're a girl who knows they like princesses and they see robots, they'll be like, oh, that's unusual. And they'll look a little bit longer. And so what we find is by the end of infancy, roughly around age 2, most toddlers can label their gender. Even if they're not talking, they can receptively point and agree if they're a boy or a girl if they show a picture of a boy or a girl on a page. And this is a major cognitive milestone. This is the cognitive milestone of gender identity stage 1, known as gender labeling. And so we talked a little bit before about gender identity versus gender expression, and this is really the first step in gender identity. This is the idea that they understand they're a boy or they're a girl, and they understand if they go to a girl's bathroom or they go to a boy's bathroom, or if they're a he or a she, they're starting to get those little pieces. We know pronouns are not perfect until they're much later, but they're starting to understand who they are at this age. Now, the missing piece of the puzzle is what about kids that will eventually have a transgender or non-binary identity? How can they label at this age? This is something that researchers are currently trying to investigate and trying to understand. And most of our data is still on cisgender kids at this point in time. So after the infancy years, what happens? Once we move into early childhood, we find that our knowledge about gender explodes. Much like our comprehension explosion and our production explosion in linguistic development, our understanding of gender and gender roles and gender norms just completely explodes. Around 4 years of age, these preschoolers love games. They love board games and they love the rules. Candyland is their favorite. And so what happens is they treat gender like a game with lots of really rigid rules. They understand that girls do this and boys do this, and they'll even make up some rules and stereotypes on their own. They might say girls have curly hair and boys have straight hair, or girls wear polka dots and boys wear stripes, or girls are pretty and boys are handsome. And as a parent, one of the things I really like doing is debunking that. I'll go and say, no, here's some boys in polka dots, or here's some girls in stripes, just to show them and knock them off their game. They'll try and do this, though. It's just intuitively. Once they find pink versus blue, they'll try and find other things that they can divide and sort by gender. So they're really into these rules of the game. And they also start to understand power segregation. They might understand that boys earn more money, or boys become doctors, or boys are the ones that drive the car, and girls are the ones that do this. And they start to understand all these different sub-roles. It's fascinating how they can categorize and make up their own gender stereotypes at this age. And one of the things that really enforces this is the peer group. Now we're talking about preschoolers or in daycares, and if they're hanging out with other kids on a regular basis, they can often act as the gender police towards other kids and even towards adults in their life. Because this is a game and you have to follow the rules. And they have that really rigid understanding. If you think back to our cognitive development unit, they have the assimilation. They can add new components to the rule book, but they don't have the accommodation yet. They're not understanding the nuance to it. And so when kids this age are playing together in mixed company, we find that girls tend to prefer to play with girls, and they tend to prefer playing feminine things. And boys tend to prefer playing with boys, and they tend to prefer playing masculine things. Now, what's a feminine thing and what's a masculine thing can change based on culture and can change over time. And so those things can vary, but they will always like to do whatever is the in vogue feminine or the in vogue masculine thing for their time and social political point in history. And so they just have a preference for the same gender. There are, of course, going to be some kids who prefer mixed gender, or they might have one friend that's another gender, but we tend to see this on average, and it's usually very, very, very strong. Of course, another thing that's a major socializing agent at this point in time is the media. Kids in the preschooler years are watching more TV, they're shopping more, they're getting presents, they're going to toy stores, and they're seeing how everything is divided in aisles of blue and pink. Now in 2021, this is not as bad as it was 10 years ago. In my personal understanding, this really reached a peak around the late 1990s and the early 2000s, and we are getting better at this now today. But at its peak, everything was divided pink and blue. And the amount of things that came in really exaggerated feminine and masculine forms were outstanding. You could buy telephones that were pink or blue, soap, pink or blue, toothbrush, pink or blue, deodorant, pink or blue. Even if you went and got like a kid's meal at a fast food restaurant, they asked you for the girl's toy or the boy's toy, even though girls and boys can play with the same toys. And so characters in kids' media were extremely exaggerated gender stereotypes. You had the sparkling princess with the doe eyes and the perfect hair wearing all the jewelry, or you had the rippling muscular hero who was brave and never upset. And so the media really portrayed these extreme versions of gender norms. We have made improvements in the last 10 years, and I want to emphasize that. We're starting to show boys that are more caring and considerate and androgynous. We're starting to show girls that are more independent and assertive and strong, and the media has really started to respond to a lot of developmental psychology's criticisms. And so through the work through sociologists and gender scholars and developmental psychologists, we've really emphasized the nuance in gender, and finally consumerism and the media has started to respond to us on this. But it did peak about 10-20 years ago, and it was really extreme. That's not to say it doesn't exist now. It definitely still exists today, but we are starting to get better and we are starting to get more nuanced with our understanding. But for most time, kids around these preschooler age, they absorb it, and this helps them to assimilate things to their rule book. And speaking of rule book, they also meet a second major cognitive milestone in terms of their gender identity. Gender identity stage 2 tends to happen around age 4, and this is when they don't just be able to label their own gender, but now they understand that gender is stable. They understand that boys grow up to be men and girls grow up to be women, for the most part. And then they understand that there is some sort of pattern to it. However, they tend to think that some situational factors can change gender instantaneously. At this age, it's very common for kids to say that if a boy grows his hair long, he becomes a girl. Or if a girl cuts her hair short, she becomes a boy. Or if a girl puts on a bow tie, or if a boy puts on a dress, that they change genders. And so although they've reached the stage of gender stability, they don't quite understand exactly how stable gender is. They understand girls become women, boys will become men, but they think that gender can change just like an on-off switch instantaneously with little to no effort. So there's not quite understanding it fully yet at this point, but it is a major second milestone. And then from early childhood, we move into later childhood. For this, we're really talking about elementary years, right? Or the preschool years, we're now into formal education, and now we're starting to get the understanding of the nuances. We understand that cutting your hair short doesn't change your gender. We understand that not all boys are masculine and not all girls are feminine, and it's okay to do your own thing. We start to get these nuances, much like the media and consumerism is finally starting to get these nuances. However, even though we understand these nuances and we're less critical of other kids and we're less going to play the gender police, we tend to still prefer to play with kids of our own gender. We tend to prefer to play with girls if we're a girl or with boys if we're a boy. And we still like gender typed play, but we'll start to play more neutral stuff. But even when we're playing neutral stuff, we prefer to play around kids of the same gender as us. And now that we're in school, school becomes a major socializing agent. And so school and gender cannot be understated. If you think about many North American elementary classrooms, a lot of our teachers are women. A lot of our cafeteria workers are women. And a lot of our coaches and janitorial staff are men. That teaches students right away about gender roles and division of labor. This makes it hard for boys to really see themselves in the classroom if a lot of their early teachers are women. We also know in elementary years there's a lot of emotional labor that the teachers do. So that may teach boys that they don't have to do the emotional labor. That's for women. That's for women to care for the early grade 1 and grade 2 students. We also know that teachers tend to enforce a lot of gender stereotypes. They tend to encourage girls when they're quiet, encourage boys when they're assertive, but punish boys when they're disruptive. And they also tend to do things like make boys and girls teams in co-ed phys ed. And so then they feel like that's such a division and it's boys versus girls all the time. And of course, consumerism plays a big part in socialization in school too. We have to think about the gender types of backpacks and pencil cases and the types of sports that they're played and how that plays a role. So if there's so much role modeling and different things around them at school, that becomes another major socializing agent. And finally, in late childhood, we begin to find the last stage of gender identity development, and this is really gender consistency. This happens around age 7. It can happen a little bit earlier, around age 6 though. And this is the idea that they realize gender is not based on situation or clothes or haircut. Gender is something that's not those things. It's more intangible and more complicated. And so this is the idea, they understand that a girl with short hair who wears pants is still a girl, and a boy with long hair who wears skirts is still a boy. And that's not your gender. Your gender identity is separate from your gender expression. And this can always throw us down the existential rabbit hole of, if it's not your expression, what is gender identity? Does it even matter? But kids seem to get it by the time they're age 7. And so they understand that gender is something not as quickly changeable as that.